appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. This is my first round of opportunities to talk about my latest work, which is titled, as you know, Ottomans and Armenians, a study in counterinsurgency. I'm going to kind of baby steps here, tell you a little bit about what I think about history and how I think about history, and that frames what I do as a historian. That is informed by 27 years in uniform, 4 combat deployments, ears blown out. I can't. So when you ask me questions, please speak loudly. I have a lifelong passion for military history. From the time I was a little boy, I picked up and read books about military history. It's been my obsession intellectually my whole entire life. My doctoral work is on combat effectiveness between the Ottoman Army and the British Army in a 4-year period in World War I. How is it that a peasant army of illiterate Ottoman agricultural agrarian peasants, if you will, can defeat for 3 years in a row the industrialized, literate, comprehensively trained and equipped forces of the British? I mean, it's a question that defies understanding today. That's how I got into this. I prefer the kinetic side. Kinetic being military speak for killing people. I mean, that's what interests me in military history. The non-kinetic side, what the military does today, counterinsurgency or COIN, is a different animal. It's one of a number of missions people do today. I'm not so much interested in that. I happen to get interested in this particular topic by way of First World War studies. It's a part of the Ottoman record. It's a part of the Ottoman Army's waging of a multinational, industrialized alliance warfare sustained over a 4-year period. So I kind of backed into this subject. It's, as you know, contentious. And there are a number of people here from the Turkish side, from the Armenian side. There are a number of people who are intellectually interested in this. But this is a topic that, as we approach April 2015, will be current in American politics, and especially with the legislative effort that goes on one side or the other to recognize some of these events. So that's my background. I'm a specialist. If people tell you they're an expert, be careful, because they're the person that's read 5 more books than you have. I'm not necessarily the world's sole source of information on this particular subject. I specialize in it. I happen to know a lot about it because I've been in the archives in England and in Turkey. I've read almost every book published on this in several languages. But it's a specialist field. It's changing. It changes constantly. Okay, history. What is it? It's a narrative. It fits an agenda. It's told by a person for a certain reason. It's not necessarily the truth, although it may come close to the truth. History changes. World War I, for example. If you picked up a book on World War I in 1970, for example, 50 years after those events, you would find that World War I was thought to be trench warfare, horrific conditions, slaughter on a massive scale, unprecedented in human history, and you would come across this phrase, lions led by donkeys. Lions led by donkeys. That was the prevailing historiography of the war at that point. The generals were incompetent. They were uncaring. They needlessly recklessly threw away men's lives. We know today that's not true. Absolutely not true. The generals were smart. They were school trained. They were staff college graduates. They worked incessantly to find technological, innovative solutions to the tactical problem of crossing no man's land. That's how do we know that today? People have taken that previous lions led by donkeys thing and rejected it and said there must be more to it. Gone into the archives, historiography today is different. So history changes. The evolving history of World War I, we're just now understanding after 100 years what happened. The Armenian-Ottoman history starts probably 1970s. There isn't a lot on it before that time. So it's a new history. The historiography isn't 100 years old. The historiography is only 40 years old. And we're now in the infant stage of that. But history is a handmaiden. You can clothe her any way you want and put her out there. That's what historians do. They try not to, but almost everybody in the field brings in some kind of a predisposition, agenda, a point of view, and it happens. So the question that I pose to students is you have to understand whose history is it. Is it an official history from a country? Is it a memoir? Is it a narrative by a participant? Is it from the archives? Those questions have to be asked. Whose interest does it serve? Official histories of the war, of any war, serve the military interests of that country. They are staff officer products written by staff officers for the use of training new staff officers, for example. How's it being used? One of the examples I like to talk about, there's a wonderful book by Tamim Ansari called Destiny Disrupted, A History of Western Disorder in the Middle East. And the initial chapter is all about these issues. History. Whose history is it? And how does a particular history affect the thinking of a population? Here's what Ansari says. You're familiar with this history. This is what you had in 10th and 11th grade. The Dark Ages, and then the Renaissance, and the Reformation, and the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Revolutions, and the Age of Imperialism. They all merge. And Ansari says this curriculum is used by Americans and Westerners to explain the world as it is. Why do we teach world history to children? Well, so they can understand the world they inhabit. They make rational decisions. So this is a rationalization of a Western curriculum that supports an agenda, the triumph of democratic capitalism. We take it up to the Cold War in 1991 and the West wins. That's the bottom line. That's how the Western curriculum evolves. This is used to explain that point. Ansari then goes on to talk about a Middle Eastern curriculum. He is, I think, of Iranian extraction. I don't verify this to be a typical Middle Eastern curriculum. This is what he says it looks like. Similar events, packaged different. Catastrophe, rebirth, permeation of the East by the West. We call it the Age of Imperialism if you read a typical high school textbook in our country. Ansari says that this curriculum, the same basic curriculum, is used to explain the Islamist reaction. When you're teaching history of the Middle East today, the world as it is in the Middle East is the Islamist reaction against secular forces. So how do you explain that? This is what Ansari presents. I think it's a compelling argument. Ansari goes on to say that people misuse history. Americans in particular try to explain the world in their terms using their notions about curriculum and historical fact. And Ansari says you cannot use a Western interpretation to explain the Islamist reaction. It's a very interesting book. Destiny Disrupted. I can't highlight it enough. Now, you all know this, so this is a refresher class. What's the effect? This is the effect. We all come in here, unless you're a specialist with these events, and you've read widely and deeply, vertically and horizontally, the historiography of these events, you might come in here with foundation myths or received wisdom. You might come in here with generalizations and things about identities of people in the Middle East. That's what happens if you try to apply the pre-existing history of these events to something like what happens in Eastern Anatolia from March to September of 1915. I'm going to try to take you away from this. I've written several articles on this subject, published in academic journals. So the idea is out there. You may be familiar with those articles. If not, this may be a new take for you on how I go through this. Insurgency in the Ottoman Empire. This is the sick man of Europe. This has been the world's premier military power until the 1600s. They go into a series of system collapse, cascade failures of different kinds, bad things happen. By 1878, they've been through a series of catastrophic wars, and chunks of the Ottoman Empire have been chopped off by the Russians and the Austrians, part of it by the British, and it's called the sick man of Europe. And now at this point in 1878, the peoples of the Balkans are after the Ottoman provinces in the Balkans. It is a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, pluralistic populated empire of people, but it is run by an Ottoman dynasty that goes way back to the 1300s. So it is a top-down dynastic system, one of 4 or 5 still in existence in Europe that will collapse in 1918. But there it is. It is made up of oppressed peoples. I'm not a scholar in the history of oppressed peoples. I am a specialist in military history. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a scholar of oppressed peoples. I'm not a social historian. I'm a military historian. But I throw it out there that of course, the subject peoples in this empire are unhappy. How could they not be? So are the peoples in the Russian Empire. So are the people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is a symptom of the age. It's part of the process of empire building. You acquire and absorb and assimilate other people. The Russians go to the point in the early 1880s of Russification. How do we solve this? Well, one problem is we're going to Russify people. We're going to change their names, change their language, change their religion, change their dress. And people who used to be Armenians and Kazakhs and Jews are now going to be Russians. And that's one solution. But that's part of the age. It's a weak empire. They're unindustrialized. They've missed the Industrial Revolution. They missed the boat entirely on the Industrial Revolution. They're broke. They borrow money. They're leveraged and in debt up to their ears. Poverty and illiteracy, peasant thinking permeate this tottering empire. It is a target for insurgency. And the term I would use to describe what happens here after 1878 kind of crystallizes in 1890 to 1912. We call it today persistent war. Persistent war. We've been at it now since 2001. We're tired of it. It's only 2013. These people have been doing it for a 20, 30-year period longer than we have. But it's persistent war. It affects how they think about the world. They see threats in the world. They see dissident minorities trying to chop away pieces of the empire. And from 1890 to 1912, you've got Armenians who are seeking autonomy and independence. You've got people called the Macedonians. Not really the Macedonians as you know them today, that old truncated state kind of north of Greece, but these are predominantly Bulgars and some Greeks, but they generally collectively call themselves the Macedonians. Huge problem in Macedonia. The Kurds are restive, and there are Kurdish rebellions. Way down in Yemen, huge rebellion, tribal-centric, tribal imam-led rebellion way down in Yemen. We're doing drone strikes there to this day. It's not finished down there. Crete and the Greeks. This is an Ottoman possession. There are Cretan rebels on Crete. The Arab rebellion. We tend to think of T.E. Lawrence, the Arab Revolt in 1916. It goes way back before. These are recurrent problems. Libya. The Senussi tribesmen are a persistent problem and rebel as well. And lastly, the Albanians. Now, these are the major groups. There are all kinds of subgroups and splinter groups and little populations of different people. There are Zionists even in Palestine. They aren't rebels, but they're trying to carve out a place for themselves. So this is a persistent problem. What do? They deploy the army. Thousands of people to crush these rebellions. It doesn't matter whether they're legitimate. It doesn't matter to the Ottomans whether these people these oppressed peoples, and they genuinely are oppressed peoples, have rights that are being abused. It doesn't matter to the Ottomans. They're trying to hold the Ottoman Empire together. Resources drive policy. Resources provide direction to policy. They determine policy. What resources do the Ottomans have? They've got the army. They've got 300,000-400,000 men in uniform. When these things pop up, they send 40,000 off for 3 years and crush it. Or they send 30,000 off to Yemen and they can't crush it, and it goes on and on and on. But how they deal with this is through kinetic means. They deploy the army. So the resources to deal with this are in place. Okay. Things change in Europe after the age of Napoleon. There are nationalist aspirations from minority peoples and oppressed peoples throughout Europe, and this starts on a wave of revolutions in 1830, crushed by the concert of Europe. A second wave of revolutions in 1848, European-wide, big cities, popular uprisings, crushed by Metternich's concert of Europe. Things changed after that. Europeans recognized we can't revolt en masse and fight European regular armies. So the character of European insurgency, European rebellion, European, however you want to use that term, changes. And I call it insurgency by committee. These are small clandestine groups. There are nihilists in Russia. There are anarchists in Italy. Bolsheviks will come along later in Russia. There's the Black Hand of Bosniaks, supported by the Serbs. It brings Europe into World War I. There are also two groups in the Ottoman Empire that are worthy of attention. The first is the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, operating in Constantinople and Anatolia, where the Armenians live. The second is the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, the IMRO, operating in what's now western Bulgaria, the country of Macedonia, and kind of into lower Serbia and Albania. These are the two groups. What do they look like? They look like these pictures. There's a signature photograph of these guerrillas, and they have bandoliers, kind of like Mexican bandits. They look like Pancho Villa in a sort. There are hundreds of photos of these people dressed like this. What are their aspirations? What are their goals? They are socialist leaning. Some are Marxist leaning. They have manifestos. They have newspapers. So there's a whole historiography, there's a whole printed literature of what they're trying to do. The one that's a good example is the ARF, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Dashnaks. This is their manifesto. It works on propaganda by deed. How do you get people's attention? You commit terrorist acts. You rebel. You assassinate local leaders. You arm the people. These are some examples. Now, is this the Turkish perspective? Yes, it is. But there's also a literature, a robust literature on these committees written by who? Louise Nalbandian, Hrac Dashnebebian. I mispronounce his name all the time. Dikran Kaligian. There's an Armenian literature in English that's worth your attention if you're interested in what these Armenian committees aspire to, how they operate, and what they do over time. They're organized like the Bolsheviks, like the nihilists. There are small secret cells that are compartmentalized from each other. If you're in the Georgetown cell, you don't know who's in the George Washington cell, and you don't know who's in the cell over here at George Mason. You only know the 10 people in your cell. This is the way our guerrilla insurgent organizations operate. They're secret. They're heavily armed. They are ready to act at a moment's notice. There's a political side, kind of an above-board political element. Then there's the military element that's cellular and secret. There are internal committees, there are external committees. Where do these people get their support from? They get money and support and weapons from external sources, from the Armenian constituency living in the Caucasus, from the Bulgarian constituency living in Paris or up in Belgrade. And they send money and weapons and support. That's the way it operates. Arms are smuggled relentlessly into the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians predominantly come in through Russia. What's now Russia, what's now the country of Armenia, Azerbaijan, into eastern Anatolia. There are counterpart arms smuggling routes coming in through western Turkey, Bulgaria, and primarily through the little port of Tekirdağ. Tekirdağ is an Armenian and Revolutionary Federation arms hub. This goes on for many, many, many years. Are we talking millions of rifles? No, we're talking a load of 100 rifles, or 50 pistols, or 10 mules with ammunition strapped on the backs. Over time, this constant flow is accumulated not just by the Armenians, but by the Kurds, by the Macedonians. This is a systemic problem within the Armenian, or within the Ottoman Empire. There they are. I don't know who these guys are. They are armed with Mauser pistols. The Mauser pistol becomes the signature weapon of the Van Rebellion, the Van Insurrection in April 1915. I know these are Armenians. I believe they're from the city of Van, and I think this was taken 1912, 1913, 1914. Who are they? They're not peasants. They're not farmers. This is a bourgeoisie group. This is a group that's composed of intelligentsia. They are teachers. They are businessmen. They are religious leaders. They are mayors. So that's one more signature of both the Macedonian committees and the Armenian committees. Who is in a committee? The Armenians are typically urban dwellers. They're not peasant farmers out in the hinterlands. So these committees tend to be organized and importantly, of literate, highly motivated people. Bourgeoisie. That's kind of the term that I think about them. Interesting faces. Nobody's smiling. I don't know why. Okay. What can we say about the Armenian committee? And this list also would fit the Macedonian, the INRO, the Internal Macedonian committee. They're extremely well organized, well armed. Well armed is a relative term. How many guns does it take to start a revolution? You know, we're not talking 2 million. We're talking 2,000 here, 500 there, different places. But the committees themselves, every committeeman has a weapon of some sort. A modern, either a Mauser rifle, a Nagant rifle from Russia, maybe a Mauser pistol. They're heavily armed. It's a relative term. They're politically indoctrinated. They have secret meetings, and they talk about the manifestos, and they talk about their aspirations and their goals. They're committed to use revolutionary means. Terrorism is not off the plate. This is a give and take problem for some of the committees. There are committeemen who don't want to do this. There are others who do. But the fact is that from 1890 to 1912, 1914, there are a lot of terrorist activities conducted by committees in the Ottoman Empire. They will use any means necessary. They are supported externally. Tbilisi, in what's now Russia, is a hub of Armenian activity. So too is Paris. So too is Sofia in Belgrade. And this is where the external leadership is. I talked about this, notables and intelligentsia. Some of you may be familiar with the idea that on 24 April 1915, the Ministry of the Interior takes away 300 Armenians from Constantinople. Who are they? They're intelligentsia. Are they all in the committees? No. Might they be in the committees? Maybe. So they're taken away. But this is who's attracted to these kinds of organizations. This is important. Membership is, we're not talking about a popular revolt. We're not talking about 500,000 people spontaneously rising up to fight the Ottomans. We're talking about small groups. This is a limited membership. Most Armenians are not members. We have to remember this. It doesn't take the entire population to start a revolution. How many Al-Qaeda are in Fallujah right now that are causing a problem for Prime Minister Maliki? It's not the entire city of Fallujah. It's probably less than 50 people. Heavily armed, motivated, indoctrinated, ready to cause trouble. So I keep that in the back of my mind when I go through this. Where do the Armenians live? Most of them live in eastern Anatolia. Most of them live in these provinces over here, adjacent to the then Russian Empire. The next densest concentration is here in Constantinople. So they are distributed in all provinces, but there are two areas where they are more densely proportional to the population of those provinces. So that's where they live. How accurate is the data? Some people say 2 million Armenians tops, some people say 1 million. Most people kind of split the difference and say maybe 1.5 million Armenians in 1914 inhabit the Ottoman Empire. This is important in the narrative. The ones in the east tend to be Orthodox Armenians. They have a patriarch in Constantinople. They are very tightly and closely aligned with the Armenian Catholicos in Tbilisi, Georgia, then Tbilisi, Russia. So there are different kinds of Armenians. There are Orthodox Armenians. The preponderance are this. There are Catholic Armenians. There are Protestant Armenians. How come? Because Americans and Germans predominantly have had missions in the Ottoman Empire for 100 years trying to convert Armenians and others to Protestantism and Catholicism. So there are really three versions. This is the most numerous. This is I don't have a good number. I'm going to say 85% are Orthodox. They also live in different places. There's a concentration. Okay. The Ottoman Army. Peasants, mostly illiterate. They beat the British at Gallipoli. They're very highly trained staff officers. It's kind of a two-tier army. There's an upper crust of highly trained staff officers. There's a lower 95% of peasants, most of whom are illiterate, most of whom have no political aspirations, most of whom would rather go back home on the farm than be in the army, and they're conscripted for 2 years. So this is a mass conscripted army. What happens in the summer of 1914? We all know the story of what happens in the summer of 1914. Europe mobilizes. To the surprise of most people who live in Europe, who think the future is going to be peaceful and productive, Europe mobilizes, and the armies go to the frontiers. And the same thing happens with the Ottoman army. They are not at war. This is what they call precautionary mobilization. We might be at war, and we don't want to be surprised. So in the summer of 1914, the Ottoman army starts to mobilize, and within 2 or 3 months, it deploys to its wartime stations. All of Europe is doing this. 6 or 7 August 1914, the Germans will be impounding the Belgians. By the 10th of August 1914, they're in France. The Russians are marching. This is what's happening in Europe. They wind up in 3 places primarily. How come? Because the Ottoman war plan in 1914 does not imagine going to war with the Entente powers, does not imagine being at war with the French or British. Who might we be at war with? Well, the Bulgarians and the Greeks, number one. That's why the bulk of the army goes to the Straits in the Constantinople area, and maybe the Russians, number 2. So another third of the army goes to the Caucasian frontier. And in November, when they go to war with the Entente as a surprise, now they've got Egypt and Mesopotamia to worry about. So as we go into December 1914, what we have is the entire Ottoman army mobilized and on the frontiers. Many of you who are familiar with military history know the problem, the perennial problem Germany has. What is it? It's a 2-front war. It exists in the time of Frederick the Great, it exists in the time of Kaiser Wilhelm II, it exists in the time of Adolf Hitler. It's thought to be a strategic problem. It's a dilemma for military planners. This is a 4-front war. The Ottomans have 4 fronts to manage. It's an almost impossible military situation. Okay, the spring of 1915, we deployed the army to the frontiers. What else is in the background that's important for the Ottomans to think about? The context of the revolutionary committees. These committees in different places have been rebelling for a number of years. They still exist. There's been kind of a sine curve of on-again, off-again good relations with the Ottomans. There's a period in 1908, 1909 when the Armenians and the Ottoman government, the new government, are pretty pleased with each other, looking forward to a bright future. Then it kind of goes down, and then it comes up again. By 1912, it's on the ascendant, and then it goes down again. So this is an on-again, off-again good relations between the Armenians and the Ottoman government. Even during the periods of good relations, the Armenian committees do not disarm. They maintain the capability, they maintain the capacity. Ottoman intelligence services, very, very, very good. It's cognitive dissonance. How can the Turks be good at intelligence? But they are. The Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of War have very, very advanced, we call it today human intelligence acquisition assets who send in good information. The Ottomans know more about what the British are doing than the British know about the Ottomans at this point in history, in 1914. They have annual congresses, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and the Hunchaks as well. Both the Dashnakhs and the Hunchaks have congresses annually. The latest one has been in Erzurum on the eve of the war. Armenian opinion at the Congress is split. There are some Armenians who want to support the Ottoman government as loyal citizens. There are some Armenians at the Congress who want to join the Russians and fight the Ottomans and gain independence. So there is not uniformity on the part of the committees. The Turks, the Ottomans, think differently. They think the committees are committed to armed rebellion and independence. The reports are conclusive about that. What else is happening? In the summer of 1914, Ottoman Armenians with military training in the Ottoman army are going across the frontier at the encouragement of the wing of the Armenian committee that wants independence, and they're forming Druzini. It's a regiment or a legion. So these are Ottoman citizens in Russia, armed and equipped and trained and put in Russian uniforms for the purpose of helping the Russians invade the Ottoman Empire. There are 4 or 5 of these things, Druzinis. The most famous is led by the great military leader Anturnik. They're going to show up later on. There's a quasi-war on the northeastern frontier. The Ottomans have deployed the special organization, the Tashkilat Masusa. The Russians have deployed counter forces. There's a irregular war going on in places like Ardavan and near Van and Sarikamish. Escalating and accelerating acts of terrorism. Hit this again. In the spring of 1915, also the British are about to invade Gallipoli. They know 70,000 people are packed up on ships and they're going to come ashore somewhere pretty close to the Dardanelles. So there's that. The last thing is logistics. The whole key to understanding why the Armenians might be a threat, as small in number as they are, gets down to logistics. Many military historians would tell you you can't understand military history. The key to military history is to understand logistics. It drives armies. And by logistics, I mean things like food and fodder and ammunition and supplies. If you don't have those, you can't fight. Good. I was talking to Sinan earlier today. To get a gallon of gas to Afghanistan, for a Marine in Afghanistan to have a gallon of gas, it takes 7 gallons of gas to get it there. The stuff's got to come through Karachi, it gets put in tanker trucks and taken up through the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan. So to get 1 gallon of gas to Afghanistan, 7 in the pipeline. What happens if you take out 1 or 2 gallons in the pipeline? It's not simply a question of interdicting the pipeline for a day or two. You could do that. But the net effect is the 7 gallons shrinks down to 5 gallons. So you don't get a gallon up there. You get 2/3 of a gallon. That's how logistics operate. Without logistics, you can't fight. That's what they're worried about. I'll show you. These are the roads. The area of concern is the 3rd Army here on the northeastern frontier. Notice the Armenian communities. These are large Armenian communities living in these towns. They are urban dwellers. Is every Armenian in Urfa in a committee? No. Only a tiny number, but the tiny number heavily armed, militarized committees. So that is in the background. The lines of communication, similar to the slide I just showed you. What I would point out here is that in 1914, railroads are everything. How come the Germans can't execute the Schlieffen plan like they want to in France? Well, the reason is because the railroads only go up to the Belgian border, and everything else has to be carried forward by horses and mules and draft animals. Well, the logistics collapse. The problem here is that supplies come down the railroad to this point, and then they've got to be moved out to the front. And they got to be moved by horses and oxen. In the whole Anatolian theater, there are 12 motor cars. There are no trucks. So the Ottomans have to devote 14,000 people and 27,000 animals to lugging stuff up. And the roads are in bad repair. So for the army to fight, the lines of communication have to stay open. There's a whole logistics architecture. There's the third lines of communication inspectorate that supports the Third Army. There's the fourth lines of communications inspectorate that supports the Fourth Army. And it's very comprehensive. It starts to get interdicted. All of a sudden, starting in December, when the war starts for the Ottomans, November 6, 1914. It starts in December, January, February, March. It starts to have an effect of minor insurrections, pinpoint attacks on convoys, checkpoints, police stations being blown up, all along the road networks. And how do we know this? The Turkish military archives have a comprehensive record of reports. When somebody gets in combat in Afghanistan and there's an attack, after the attack, right, an after action report, they send it up. Well, the Ottomans did that as well. So there's a ton of incidents here that are recordable. The one that is the most important, the one that metastasizes, if you will, what the Turks, what I call the Armenian insurrection, the Armenian rebellion, happens in the city of Van. And that's this one over here on the east, in the far east. The city of Van has been a perennial hotspot of Armenian activity for the past 30 years. The Armenian committee there is well led, it's well armed, it's motivated. For whatever reason, what's the Armenian position? We're being attacked, we're oppressed, we've got to defend ourselves. What's the Turkish position? These people have in concert with the Russians, raised rebellion and taken the city and the citadel. Polarized positions. There may be some middle ground. You know, is it the chicken or the egg? You know, does this thing start in April of 1914, or do you take it back to 1913 or 1908, or even the rebellion of 1894? So how you talk about this depends upon where you start the discussion. What we know for a fact is that in April of 1915, the city of Van is taken over and held strongly by the Armenian committees, those guys, and the signature weapon, Mauser pistols. The Turks, the Ottoman army, does not have enough strength in the area to deal with it. This happens. The external committees, organized in Druzini, and the Russian army then attack from the east. So this is the Ottoman nightmare come true. This is people in the rear areas in rebellion who have an orchestrated plan with the Russian enemy to seize the city and pave the way. In the Spanish Civil War, this would be called the fifth column. The fifth column. That's not a historical term that we can apply here, but it's a similar condition. This then sends, I was going to say a ton of messages. There are dozens of messages across the Third Army area that go up to Constantinople trying to make sense of this, trying to explain what it means and what the outcome might possibly be. This is what Ambassador Morgenthau says about the event. This is the guy, if there's one person you should be careful of, and you read his memoirs, it's him. He's wrong most of the time. He doesn't speak Turkish. He has contempt for the Turks. He's bigoted. He is chauvinistic. He looks down his nose at the Turks. He has an Armenian dragoman and an Armenian translator, so he's getting filtered information. This is what he thinks. There's an insurgency. They've taken possession of Van, and they're fighting in very difficult circumstances. What's not right? He says 25,000 people are in revolt. No, can't possibly. We know today not possible. Not possible. But why I throw this up here is that what happens in Van is well documented. There are American State Department messages that talk about it. There are German archival messages. There are Turkish, Ottoman State Archive. And this is a very well documented event. You'll notice in World War I, stalemate occurs. No man's land, trenches, warfare, all that stuff. Progress is measured in yards. The Somme, July 1st, 1916. The British put a dent in German lines. It's like 250 yards. They lose 1 million men. This thing, the dent in the Turkish lines goes 80 miles. So how successful is this? This is World War I. What would have happened in France if somebody put an 80-mile dent in the Western Front? I mean, incomprehensible. This is an 80-mile dent in the Ottoman lines. It is catastrophic potential. If they do it again, and you go back to where the Armenians live, they live in Van, but they also live in Erzurum, and they live in Urfa, and they live in Sivas, and they live in all these other. What if every Armenian committee in every town does this? Then it's a problem. What happens if all these Armenian committees, in concert with the Russians, isolate the army in concert with a military attack? You got a problem. What's the strategic dilemma? There are no Ottoman combat forces in central Anatolia to deal with this. They've been deployed. How do we know they've been deployed? If you don't trust the Ottoman archives, you can go to the British National Archives in Kew and read the intelligence reports from the Imperial General Staff. I don't read Russian, but in Moscow and in Leningrad, St. Petersburg today, the Russian archives outline where the Ottoman army is. This is military intelligence. So they're not in central Anatolia. Resources determine policy. Resources determine policy. How have they dealt with this problem in the past? They've sent an expeditionary force to Yemen of 40,000 people. They've sent the army, the old Second Army, to Macedonia of 100,000 people to crush the Macedonians. So the application, the military solution to the problem is to send the army. The army can't be sent because it's not there. It's fighting on the fronts, on this four-front war. So what do? How do you deal with this? I throw up a couple quotes. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It has the effect of being true. What do I mean by this? Go back to 2003. If you're writing a military history of the intervention, of the invasion of Iraq, it doesn't matter whether they've got yellow cake Iranian or whether they've got weapons of mass destruction. What matters in explaining the American decision to go to war is what George Bush and Cheney thought. So if you're explaining why America goes to war, the explanation is similar to this. The choice of explanation determines the nature of the problem's resolution. Cheney and Wolfowitz and Feith and George Bush think one thing. We know, and you can do the conspiracy thing. That isn't what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is why did they decide to go? If you want to write an extended history, go back and say, well, and judge them as being wrong, which they clearly were, that's something else. But the Ottomans thought this was a strategic problem that couldn't be fixed with what was at hand. What happens? They relocate lots of people. The semantics are important. Relocation, I picked that word because there is an implication that the people can return. There's nothing in the archives, there's nothing in the Turkish record from the period of April through the ending of the movement of peoples that indicates that they were permanently gone. Other words could be deportation. That means permanently gone. Exile, that means permanently gone. The intent of the Ottoman state is to move these people and bring them back at some future date. How come? Some of the Armenians, not everybody, but some of the Armenians are causing a problem. They're impeding the delivery of supplies. They're collaborating with the enemy. Some of them were involved in the takedown, the seizure of the city of Van. This is from the Ministry of the Interior. There are complementary messages. There are two streams of message traffic and policy documents. Ministry of War, Ministry of the Interior. Two of them. This is the Ministry of the Interior's take. They get this take from their own intelligence apparatus and from the military reports. it results in this famous decree. The Sultan, does he do this? No, he rubber stamps it. He's a figurehead. He's a puppet. This is Talat and Enver. But this is what they do. They move people. This is an important phrase. The conduct of such rebel elements rather than necessary to remove them from areas of military operations and to evacuate the villages serving as bases of operations and shelters for the rebels. We're going to separate rebels from their base of support. If you study guerrilla warfare, Mao Zedong will instantly come to mind. Thomas Lawrence will instantly come to mind. This is a military strategy to separate people from their base of support. How come? Because we can't deal with them like we used to deal with them. We can't send 100,000 men. They're busy at Gallipoli beating off the British. What's the spatial characteristics? Where do those provinces align with on the map? These are eastern provinces of Orthodox Armenians. So he uses the phrase some of the people. There are some people in Constantinople who are taken away, but not all. So one of the important things is that this is tailored. It's a template put on a map, and this is where they're going to take the bulk of the people out. Okay. Somehow this has been missed in the whole entire historiography of these events, and it's relocation as a military strategy. I'm going to play Jeopardy here for just a minute. Some of the older people may be able to answer this. Alex, I'll take literature for 20. This is the forest primeval. This is the forest primeval.
From Newfoundland, I believe it was, Longfellow's poem.
Longfellow's poem, Evangeline. That's right.
Evangeline, yes, sent them down to Louisiana.
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote this poem called Evangeline. Back in the 50s and 60s, high school students used to read. And the opening line is, "This is the forest primeval." It's a signature line. Why do I bring that up? This is the modern history. Relocation has been with us for a long time. The British in the 1750s take Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. It's French. It's inhabited by the French. And the French population who lives there, 50 or 60,000 people, revolt in support of the French army fighting the French and Indian Wars. The British have a Dickens of a time. They can't fix the problem. They say, well, we'll just move them. And in 1756, they moved 60,000 people. Exile is they use the word exile. You ain't never coming back. And they send some to Europe and some to the 13 colonies, and a lot of them wind up in Louisiana. And they become in kind of a roundabout way the Cajuns. How come Cajuns are French influence? Well, there are Acadians. So I just throw it out, this is not new. It starts in the modern sense in Spain with General Weyler, Butcher Weyler, and he moves people in Cuba to separate guerrillas from the population. We do it in the Philippines, on Samar. We move 50, 60, 70,000 people. Now, the semantics are important. Weyler calls this, I'm not a Spanish linguist, la concentración. We call it zones of protection. The most well-known example are the British, who invent the term concentration camps in the Boer War. The British fight a very short conventional war against the Boers. That devolves into guerrilla warfare, and to solve the guerrilla warfare problem, the British do the same thing that the Ottomans do. They separate the people from the guerrillas. They put the people in camps. These are not death camps. The word is hijacked in 1942 at Wannsee. And so today we associate that word concentration camps with the Holocaust. This is not that. These are holding areas. I use the word relocation camps. We evacuate, put it nicely, relocate Nisi Japanese in 1942. Does FDR think they're a threat? Who knows? Somebody in the federal government thought the Japanese population of California was a potential threat. They were relocated to California. This goes on. It's most famous in counterinsurgency doctrines and literature is the Briggs Plan in Malaya. And the British in Malaya put 500,000 ethnic Chinese in what they call new villages. The French employ it in Algeria, the quadrillage system, 800,000 people. We do it to a limited extent in Vietnam. We call it protected hamlets. We're going to put you in a hamlet, and you'll be safe. There'll be a wall around it. The Viet Cong won't get you, and we'll feed you and take care of you. because they're nice guys. In reality, that's a counterinsurgency strategy designed to separate guerrillas from their basic support. So what I'm saying is that there's a context to relocation. You can't just look at the Ottoman experience in isolation. You have to understand this whole entire counterinsurgency strategy. Is it a doctrine? Is it a template? Counterinsurgency doctrines don't come along, as we know that term, until the 1960s. So what would you call this? You would call this a matter of practice. The Ottomans don't pick up a manual and say, oh yeah, relocation, here's, relocation, we can't do this, but we can do relocation. There is no such manual. But the Ottomans know about the Boer War, and they know about Samara, and they know about Cuba. They studied this in the staff college. So the practice is put into place. It's an important point. Lastly, I'm going to kind of wind this down. The Boer War, the most famous incident, that's what the Boer guerrillas look like. Bandoliers, kind of like the Armenians. I just throw it up, there's some similarities. The concentration camps, starving Boers. You've heard the word starving Armenians. How come? Well, you can't put 100,000 people in camps at the turn of the century and not have problems with feeding and sanitation and cholera and dysentery. Those endemic diseases go through camps like wildfire. Thousands of people die. This is a cause célèbre in the British papers. Henry Campbell Bannerman in the Parliament jumps on this. Emily Hobshouse, one of the great early 20th century humanitarians, jumps on this. Okay, what's the outcome? By 1917, those dark areas, they're down to like 0 Armenians. They're down to less than 1% of the Armenian population. Very few Armenians are taken out of Constantinople. So who gets taken to the camps? They tend to be Orthodox Armenians with strong ties to the Russians. They tend to come from these provinces. So this relocation is tailored, it's controlled. 350,000 Armenians in 1918 are still living their original homes, not in the black provinces, but over here in the western provinces. So 350,000 people are unaffected by this. How come? Because they weren't thought to be a threat to the army. Okay. These are the questions that generate historical controversy. How many of them were there in 1914? What happened to them? How many died? Was there an extermination plan? Did the Young Turks try to ethnically homogenize Eastern Anatolia? Did the Armenian state act at any time with intent to exterminate the Armenians? I can't tell you the answer to this. We all have opinions. I have opinions. I can't tell you with assurance what the answers might be. And even if I did, in 20, 30 years, the evolving historiography will present something different. So it's going to change. What I can tell you is, to this question, the Armenian Revolutionary Committee is an existential threat to the Armenian national security. They had the capability, they had capacity. Were they a threat? They are a potential threat. They activate. They cause interruptions in the supply lines. There are minor rebellions. There's the big rebellion at Van. Were they an existential threat? I think they were. Did it turn out that way? The Ottomans preempted the threat by relocation. So this is an example of military thinking. We're going to preempt the threat. It's not going to kill us. We're going to take care of it right now. But I think they were an existential threat because they had the capability, they had the capacity. Did Russia, France, and Britain conspire with the Armenian committees to instigate rebellion? Yes, they did. Those archives are packed full of information. The one you're most familiar with, not the Armenians, but that guy T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia. What do the British do? They're not just trying to get the Armenians to rebel, they're trying to get the Kurds, and they're trying to get the Arabs to rebel. In 1916, they pack up old brother Lawrence with a bunch of gold and machine guns and sent him off to Arabia to talk to Sharif Hussein to raise rebellion against the Ottomans. So it's not just in this case. The British actively conspire. They conspire with Zionists in Palestine. They conspire with Kurds. They conspire with Arabs later on. This is the first of many. So to both of these questions, my answer is yes. Okay, at the end, takeaways. my history may be different than your history. My history may be different than your history. My history has a purpose and an agenda. My history as a military is to explain the events as a counterinsurgency strategy rather than the history of oppressed peoples or something other than that. History is a narrative. It's not, this is my narrative. There are 5 narratives on these events. Mine is a 6th distinct historiographical narrative on how this thing happened. The Turkish position is way over here. The Armenian position is way over here. They are polarized. They are politicized. I think there's some meeting ground in the middle. There's some truth in the Turkish position. There's some truth in the Armenian position. We are not at the stage yet where we can meet in the middle and merge them together. But they need to be merged. I think there is middle ground. The last thing is read widely and in depth. You can't pick up 1 or 2 books and get your arms around this. It's complex. It's overlapping. And there are aspects of this that take years to really think about and understand. I've changed my view. 10, 12 years ago, I thought there was a large Armenian rebellion in eastern Anatolia. That's what the Turkish literature suggested. I have now changed my view that there's not a large Armenian rebellion. It's a small, cellular Armenian committee rebellions, insurrections, terrorism in key locations that destabilizes the strategic situation for the Ottomans. So I've changed my view. I may change it again, depending upon things. And with that, I'm done. And I'll take your questions. Sinan, you're going to...
Yeah, so I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Thank you for the presentation. We have a considerable amount of time. So if, in this scenario, would it be possible for whoever's going to ask a question to please stand and make yourself heard? We understand the need for brief comments, but if you could limit your comments to be as brief as possible and address a question. Otherwise, I'll have to cut you off for the sake of everybody else wanting to ask questions. So, yes, you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Erickson. My name is Adam Hamparian. I work with the Armenian National Committee. You said several times in your remarks that about history having an agenda. You said resources drive policy, resources determine policy. In that light and in the spirit of transparency, could you share an accounting of the relationship between the Institute of Turkish Studies, on which you serve, and the Turkish government, which both denies the Armenian genocide and criminalizes discussion of that crime?
It's way off topic. I'm on the board of governors of the Institute of Turkish Studies. The initial funding package in the Institute of Turkish Studies came from the Turkish government. The Institute of Turkish Studies has no strings attached. It's not a puppet or an organ of the Turkish government. It operates as a separate entity. It makes its own decisions, and its agenda has nothing to do with anything Armenian or the denial of the genocide. It has to do with encouraging Turkish studies in the United States. So no connection. There is no cause and effect. There's no anything like that linking the two.
Yes, ma'am.
Sharon Maynard from the Foreign Service Institute. You mentioned that most of the Armenians, 350,000 Armenians in the West were left in place because they weren't considered a threat. Why were some Armenians taken out of Constantinople? Were those folks who had been identified as being members of committees, or why?
The Ministry of Interior had comprehensive lists of who was in certain committees, and they actually had spies, Ottoman Turks with Armenian identities inside the committees, so they knew who was in the committees. And those people are taken out individually and selectively over about a 6-month period. The initial burst on 24 April 1915 is a lot of committee members, but also a lot of influential people who they don't know are in a committee but might be in a committee. But that's the selection that occurs in Constantinople. Very few of the entire population of those two provinces, Constantinople and Izmit, very few of them are taken out as a percentage compared to elsewhere.
And nothing, for example, at Izmir?
Some in Izmir, yeah. Armenians are taken from everywhere. Make no mistake. Armenians are taken from everywhere. The parts of the empire that are depopulated, where is the epicenter of removal? It is those 6 eastern provinces that are directly on top of the lines of communication of the 3rd and 4th Armies.
Thank you. I wear 2 masks here. One is the Voice of America journalist, and the other is conflict resolution. We feel that trying to earn my master's degree. Just a quick question, Professor. Do you believe in facts as such? Do you have that positivistic notion?
I'm a Tea Party Republican. I don't believe in facts.
Okay, so
as a general rule, I do believe in facts.
so very good. Because at the very beginning of your presentation, my feeling was this is, of course, selective historiography, as any historian would agree. There is an element of selectivity. But then there were just specific facts that I think were revised in the presentation and or not mentioned.
Okay.
One would be the 1908 famous fact that the ARF itself put down the weapons and became parliament members.
I mentioned the sign.
Mentioning that was not making clear for the audience here that the specific committee you were talking about has put down the weapons and became part of the established, institutionalized,
Yes,
newly Ottoman
Armenians in
term.
Parliament.
Very 9 members of
Sure.
and the Turkish government doesn't stop on repeating about this fact, which is fine. So this is, I think, a very important fact to mention.
It's in the book.
In order to
unfortunately,
be able to understand.
I couldn't compress 300 pages.
I'll make 2 questions here, just 2 questions. You talked about pluralism in the Ottoman Empire. Please describe what you mean by the pluralistic society. And let me, I'll be very quick on my second question. I'm not even going to talk about whether you call the Van as a Van process and insurrection. We tend to believe, and many historians believe it was self-defense, but we can talk about it for a long time. You're talking about Ottoman archives constantly. And unfortunately, a lot of the Armenian scholars have been long having difficulties in accessing Ottoman archives of the periods that you're talking about. You called the Pashas and the Palat and others just stamp makers and failed to talk about their own letters that have been at least published as much as it is. And I would strongly recommend to you to look into Fuat Bundar's work about the Armenians and their relocations. And probably I would like you to maybe elaborate a little more about your description of what you could call by relocation. You said it's a relocation because they were supposed to be come back. Apparently, by the end of your presentation, we saw they never came back, and nobody was hoping.
Well, I still can remember 5 things.
3 questions.
The Armenian committees participate in the Ottoman political process after 1908. By 1912, that is returned to a position of polarity. The Armenians never give up their weapons. They keep them. And one of the issues in Erzurum in August of 1914 is do we support the Allies and the Russians in the war, or do we support loyally the government of the Ottoman Empire, as we had done in 1912 against the Balkan League. So there is a sign curve. It's comprehensively addressed in the book. Van, was it self-defense? There's a little. Why does it start? The Ottoman governor decides to assassinate some of the local leaders. How come he does that? Well, because he thinks they're going to rebel. Why does he do that? Because they've rebelled in the past. So it's chicken and the egg. Where do you start the narrative? From the Ottoman perspective in Constantinople, it's not germane to the argument. How it starts does not matter to the decision makers in Constantinople. They think it's an insurrection. Morgenthau thinks it's an insurrection. The decision is made not on reality. The decision is not made on facts. It's made on what they believe. What is perceived as real has a real effect. Ottoman archives. They have been up until 1999 almost impossible to get into. Since 1999, both the military archives in Ankara and the Başbakanlık archives in Istanbul are accessible by almost anybody. Now, it's like anything else in the Middle East. It's a process. You can't. It's not like going to Kew for the British archives. It's not like going over here to the National Archives in College Park. You can't just show up and give them an ID card and have the briefing and get your card and go ask for something. To go to the Turkish archives, you got to put in a request. It's a special visa. They got to be photographed. It's got to be stamped. You got to be scheduled to community archives. You got to demonstrate some language proficiency. There are a number of steps. Is it designed to keep people out? No, it's not. It's better than ever, but it is part of a Middle Eastern climate of restriction of information. It's just part of, and it's the same in Iraq. It's the same in Saudi Arabia. So the short answer to your question is it was almost impossible before 1999. Now it is possible for almost anybody to get into the archives.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. My name is Lee Jandanian. I had the benefit of being trained in fine Jesuit institutions, of which Georgetown was one of them, in the graduate degree programs that I attended. Quite frankly, you come across as being someone who's in the hip pocket of the Turkish government. And so, if it wasn't so offensive, if it wasn't so offensive, it would be humorous. But the question is, what sort of fair and balanced approach have you taken, do you believe, in your presentation today, that would really kind of articulate kind of an even-handed discussion about what happened between 1915 and 1923? Actually, that's my question.
Thank you for your kind and generous comments.
Absolutely.
I'll try to address your concerns. I'm not paid by the Turks. I'm a federal employee, U.S. government. I can't take any money from anybody without a JAG review. I'm going to a conference in Cambridge, England in June. I've got to get reviewed by a JAG. So no, I'm not paid by the Turks. This is a military perspective. You should buy the book, read the book, and look at both sides. I present both sides. I don't go into the Armenian oppression. These are an oppressed people. There's no question. Of course they're angry. Of course they want autonomy. The Kurds in Turkey today are kind of in the same boat. But it's not about that. It's about why do the Ottoman state and the military relocate these people? Why is the relocation selective? Why isn't it countrywide? Why just these provinces? How do we explain it?
Why the disproportionate response to such these small little groups that don't communicate with one another, but all of a sudden communicated with one another and coordinated? And why the disproportionate response? Why the disproportionate? Why 1.5 million people get marched to their death as a disproportionate response to a few insurgents?
The response is tailored. It's selective. It's certain provinces. It's not everyone.
This is a subversion of scholarship. That's what this is. And I'm sorry the Georgetown community has got to be.
Go have a sandwich and cool down for a minute.
Yeah, I will.
I have a question, just a sort of military approach question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of the political parties that were formed, the ARF and the Nunchak. Do you know what years they were formed?
The proto-committees, 1885. The Armenicans, and they morph by 1886, 1890.
Okay.
They are.
Fair enough. When you know that historically Armenians have always lived within the Turkish confines and the Turkish borders peacefully with the Turkish people and the government.
Absolutely.
Right? When did the Ataturk government come into power?
1923. 1923.
The Kemal Ataturk and Talat Pasha, when did they come into power? The Young Turk Revolution, when did they come into power?
They are all members of the Committee of Union.
When did they come into power?
Yes, they are all Young Turks.
When did they come into power?
Say again?
When did they come into power?
The first time, 1908, 1909. The second time, the summer of 1913.
So, why up until per your presentation, 1915, nothing has ever happened?
I don't understand.
Well, let me finish. Why, up until 1915, per your presentation, nothing has happened between the Armenian people and any kind of military action against them? Why this happens after, per what you just said, a certain few people come into the ranks of the high-ranking Turkish military, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and then this stuff hits the fan. What does that mean?
The Armenian, well, that's not, I didn't have time to do the whole thing. When I put the slide up about where the insurgencies are, the Albanians, Libya, Yemen, the Armenian rebellion of 1895, 1896 is dealt with by sending in an army. The subsequent Armenian rebellion is dealt with by sending in an army. So there are two large-scale events in which the Ottomans send in the army. They can't send in the army in 1915 because it's deployed on the frontiers.
How many total military personnel did Turkey have at the time?
I'm sorry, what?
How many total military personnel did Turkey have during this period of time?
They, at this what, in April 1915?
No, 2013.
About 1.2 million are on duty in 1915.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that they were at the same time they were also fighting credible forces, France, England,
Sure.
blah blah blah, right? Greece, which
Yeah.
presumably
Greece
has
comes in later.
much more organized military than a bunch of insurgents, right? Why, as Lee mentioned, why the disproportionate deployment of forces against, the way you describe it, is an insurgent few in certain villages who don't really communicate? Why not take those forces and apply them to really where you feel the threat is? Coming in from the west, from Constantinople, English, Greece from the south, so on and so forth.
I thought the slide was pretty explicit. The armies go to the frontiers. The armies are deployed on the frontiers.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the conventional threat is.
Yeah.
In the spring of 1915, there are very few military forces in eastern Anatolia that can deal with these events. I thought the slide was explicit.
Can we take another question if possible? Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Kate Nahapetian with the Armenian National Committee of America. The Institute for Turkish Studies does get Turkish government funding, and the former chairman of this institute was pushed out by the Turkish government. It was documented.
I don't know what this has to do with my election.
Because you even said everyone has an agenda,
Yeah.
and I think it's important for people here to understand the Institute's agenda, your agenda, that you are on the board.
I'd really rather stay away
Quartet, he
from
was
this
the former
question.
chairman, Quartet was the former chairman of this institute, and he said that after he wrote about the Armenian genocide, he was told to call the Turkish ambassador of the United States, who is an honorary chairman of this institute.
Do you have a
And the
question?
Turkish ambassador, this is the inside higher education, this is Quartet said that the Turkish ambassador told him, quote, he made it clear that if I did not separate myself as chairman of the board, that funding for the institute would be withdrawn by the Turkish government and the institute would be destroyed. Okay.
That's between.
And that's we're
Okay,
talking about agenda.
so
And
Ma'am, we're not
then-
going to entertain more of these
what is-
questions. We need a question
Okay.
related to the
I
topic. We
know
have a
it's
question, please.
uncomfortable to hear facts that you don't
Okay.
like, but I think
This is
the
a
I'm very
question and answer
comfortable, ma'am.
period.
We're not going to do
This
this.
is not an Armenian and
We-
Turkish conflict
Do you have a
or
question for me?
perspective, yes, because
Okay, what is
the
these are
question?
scholars
What's
that
your
have written
question
about the
dealing
Armenian
with my
genocide.
election?
These are not Armenian. Taner Akçam, Yavor Aron, Omer Bakır, Yehuda
Does anybody have a
Bauer,
question
Donald
that they would like to
Boswell,
ask Professor
Israel
Erickson?
Charney, Alan Dexon, and Hassan Cemal, the grandson of Cemal Pasha, one of the three who were the masterminds of the
What is your
genocide.
question
So my
about my
question is,
election?
why are you such in the minority?
What-
Why are scholars who have the minority
What-
deny the genocide often connected with the Turkish government? That's my question.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you, ma'am.
Here's the question. The scholars who work on Ottoman and Turkish history, you don't go to England to research it. You go to Turkey to research it. So are they tied to the Turkish government? You're in Turkey does not mean you're
Hassan
a
Cemal
puppet, you're
is
a
in
puppet
Turkey.
or you're
Taner Akçam has looked at the archives in Turkey.
Taner Akçam, if you read his books, he uses questionable sources. He cherry picks. He does the same thing with President Bush did in 2003.
But
His
my
latest
question
book,
is,
for
why are
example-
so many people who deny the genocide associated with the Turkish government?
Have I denied the genocide?
Oh, so you believe it's a
Have
genocide?
have
Do you
I?
believe it was a genocide?
Do you have a question? Can we get her out of here? Shall I have you removed? I really,
kidding me?
I want to answer
This is not
questions.
Turkey,
I
and
want to
you are
answer
not allowed
questions
to
about the lecture.
silence people who don't agree
You are
with you.
way off the lecture.
Oh my gosh.
So I'd like you just to stop. Thank you.
Yes.
Good.
This is Turkey, people. This is.
That's not stopping.
Does anyone have a question they would like to ask?
Yes, Elizabeth Shelton. I believe that I read that in December of 1914, the Third Army, up fighting the Russians, had quite a disaster. Could you comment on that?
The Battle of Sarikamish, the Sarikamish campaign, starts on Christmas Day of 1914. It is an offensive in the Russian Caucasia to try to encircle part of the Russian army. It's a disaster. 30, 40, 50,000 Ottoman soldiers are killed or freeze to death up in the mountains. Its effect on the war. The Turks, the Ottomans, say the Armenians are instrumental in helping the Russians achieve that victory. That is not true. I say that in my book. The Armenians have nothing to do with that particular victory. What effect does it have? The Armenian narrative on the Sarikamish campaign is this now becomes the engine for the destruction of the Armenians. That Enver Pasha uses the Armenians as the reason for defeat. That's hard to document as well. It does have an effect in logistics. When that army is defeated and they lose their equipment and they lose their ammunition and they lose their people, these have to be replaced. That offensive destroys the logistical capacity of the Third Army Inspectorate to refill and replenish ranks. So that's the story of the Sarikamish campaigns.
Quick last question. As you were asking, so do you believe that 1915 constituted genocide? Do you believe it was a genocide?
I would rather not answer that because that's not what the book is about and it's not what the lecture is about.
Because you just said I didn't deny the genocide, I just wanted to clarify your position.
Yeah, here's what I think. I have no position. I'm ambivalent. It could have been, maybe it wasn't. I really, there are days where I wake up and I think that's probably genocide. There are days where I wake up and I think probably not. So I honestly, I've not formed an opinion on this yet.
One last question, yes.
Okay, I'm not from Turkey, I'm not from Armenia. I really respect both countries, professional and social relations in them. So my question is hopefully addresses the book and what you presented. And specifically on your label of relocation, you spoke about half an hour about it. And it affects many others. You mentioned the Boers and others. And you mentioned, are there really specific references in the Turkish files that their objective at the end was for the Armenians to return to eastern Turkey, but then at the same time the land was taken. It's part of Turkey now. And what happened in those villages? I don't know. It's really an honest question. What happened? Was it military strategy or was it?
I get your question. It is a military strategy, as it has been throughout the 20th century in many, many, many locations. What happens to the property, real property of the Armenians? At the same time, the relocation messages, well, there's a parallel message flow on safeguarding these people's homes and valuables. I think it's genuine. I think Talat genuinely intends to guard their property. As the war goes on and they don't come home, the property is seized, much like some of the property in California owned by Japanese Americans. As the war goes on, it is seized and acquired by Americans. I don't think that's why we relocate the Japanese, but it happens. And by 1918, most of the property, to my understanding, has been seized or acquired. I'm living in a house, the one next door is empty. And people take it. That's what I think happens.
Okay, I think time's up on the room. We'd like to thank Professor Erickson for his time and for all of you for making the effort to come and listen to him. So thank you very much.